There are moments in history when a single decision, made in a matter of hours, in the heat of a crisis, under enormous political pressure, changes everything. This is one of those moments. The order came from the Oval Office. 2 strikes, Kharg Island, the beating heart of Iran's oil economy, the single facility responsible for processing roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. Hit it, and you don't just damage Iran's military, you gut its economy. You cut off the oxygen that funds its missiles, its proxies, its entire regional ambition. It seemed decisive, it seemed overwhelming, it seemed, to those who ordered it, like a masterstroke. But in the war rooms of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, something else was happening, because the IRGC had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had planned for it, war-gamed it, prepared for it with a patience and a precision that the architects of the American strike had fatally underestimated. And when the US fleet moved into position, when the ships took up their strike coordinates and the pilots climbed into their cockpits, they sailed directly into a trap that had been set months, perhaps years, in advance. Welcome to Command Brief. What you are about to hear is the full story of how 2 strikes on Kharg Island triggered one of the most dangerous military crises in the modern history of the Middle East, and why Israel, America's closest ally in the region, turned and ran. Strap in, this one is going to shake you. Kharg Island, the jugular vein of Iran's economy. To understand why Trump ordered the strikes, you first need to understand what Kharg Island actually is, because most people have never heard of it. And yet, it may be the single most strategically important piece of real estate in the entire Middle East. Kharg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, about 25 kilometers off the coast of southwestern Iran. It is small, roughly 13 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide. If you drove across it, it would take you less than 15 minutes. You could walk its entire length in a few hours. But what happens on Kharg Island shapes the global economy in ways that very few places on Earth can match. Kharg is Iran's primary oil export terminal. Virtually all of Iran's crude oil, the lifeblood of a sanctions-battered economy that still manages to generate tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue, passes through Kharg Island before it reaches the tankers that carry it to customers in China, India, and elsewhere. The island is a maze of pipelines, storage tanks, loading platforms, and pumping stations. It processes, stores, and ships oil at a rate that makes it one of the most critical energy infrastructure nodes in the world. Destroy Kharg Island, and you do not just hurt Iran, you potentially cut off a significant fraction of global oil supply virtually overnight. Oil prices would spike. Markets would convulse. Countries that depend on Iranian crude, China most prominently, would face sudden energy shortfalls. This is precisely why Kharg Island has been a target in previous conflicts. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraq struck Kharg Island repeatedly, trying to strangle Iran's oil revenues and force a negotiated end to the war. Iran repaired the damage each time, kept the oil flowing, and fought on for years. That history matters, because it tells you something important about both the strategic logic of targeting Kharg Island and the limits of what strikes on it can actually achieve. Trump's advisors knew all of this. They ordered the strikes anyway. And the reasons why reveal as much about the political pressures driving American decision-making as they do about military strategy. The decision. Why Trump ordered the strikes. The decision to strike Kharg Island did not come out of nowhere. It was the product of weeks of escalating tension, failed diplomacy, and a political environment in Washington that was pushing hard for decisive action. Iran had spent months refusing to negotiate seriously on its nuclear program. Despite American military pressure, despite the carrier strike groups positioned in the Gulf, despite the sanctions, despite the diplomatic ultimatums, Tehran had continued enriching uranium, continued supporting its regional proxies, and continued making what the Trump administration characterized as threatening moves against American assets and allies. The breaking point, as it so often is in these situations, was a specific incident. Iranian-backed forces had struck an American base. There were American casualties, and the political pressure on the White House to respond with something more than another round of sanctions or strongly worded statements was overwhelming. Trump had been clear throughout his return to the presidency. He did not want endless, inconclusive military engagements. He wanted decisive action. He wanted results. And he believed, based on the advice of certain military and civilian advisors, that a strike on Kharg Island would deliver exactly that: hit Iran where it hurt most, demonstrate American resolve, forced Tehran to the negotiating table. 2 strikes were ordered. the first targeting the oil loading platforms and pipeline infrastructure on the northern end of the island, the second targeting the main storage tank farm and pumping stations on the southern end. Together, the strikes were designed to render the facility non-operational for months, perhaps years. The planning was meticulous, the intelligence was assessed as solid, the strike packages were assembled, the timing was coordinated with Israeli intelligence, and the order was given. What nobody in that planning process fully accounted for was what the IRGC had been quietly building on the other side of the equation. The IRGC, masters of the trap. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a conventional military force. It does not think like a conventional military force, and it does not fight like one. The IRGC was created in the aftermath of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, specifically to protect the revolutionary government against both external enemies and internal threats. Over the 4 decades since, it has evolved into something far more complex and far more dangerous than a simple paramilitary organization. It runs businesses, it controls territory, it operates proxy forces across the Middle East, and it has developed a military doctrine that is built entirely around one core principle: never fight America on America's terms. The IRGC's strategic doctrine is what military theorists call asymmetric warfare taken to its logical extreme. They have studied American military operations with extraordinary care. They know how American carrier strike groups are organized. They know American attack patterns and targeting priorities. They know the capabilities and limitations of American weapons systems, and they have spent years building specific countermeasures designed to exploit every vulnerability they have identified. The trap at Kharg Island was not improvised. It was not a hasty response to American pressure. It was a carefully constructed strategic ambush that the IRGC had been preparing for months, possibly years, in anticipation of exactly the kind of strike that Trump ordered. Here is how it worked. The IRGC understood that any American strike on Kharg Island would require the US fleet to move into specific positions in the northern Persian Gulf. The geography of the Gulf is constraining, the waters are relatively shallow, the distances are short, and the positions that American ships need to occupy to conduct effective strikes on Kharg are predictable because they are dictated by the range and targeting requirements of the weapons being used. The IRGC had mapped those positions with extraordinary precision. They had pre-positioned assets, missile batteries, fast attack boat squadrons, submarine patrols, and drone swarms, in locations designed to create overlapping fields of fire that would converge on exactly the waters where American ships would need to operate. They had also done something even more sophisticated. They had created a layered deception operation, a series of false signals and movements designed to draw American intelligence assets to focus on the wrong areas, while the real trap was being quietly assembled in locations that American satellites and reconnaissance aircraft were not watching closely enough. When the US fleet moved into position for the Kharg Island strikes, they were not moving into a defensive environment. They were moving into a carefully prepared killing ground, and the IRGC watched them come. The strikes. What happened at Kharg Island? The strikes themselves went according to plan. At least, the American side of them did. American aircraft, a combination of carrier-based FA-18 Super Hornets and long-range B-1B Lancers operating from bases outside the Gulf region, delivered precision-guided munitions on Kharg Island in 2 coordinated waves. The first wave struck the northern loading platforms and pipeline infrastructure with a combination of JDAM precision bombs and AGM-154 joint standoff weapons. The second wave followed minutes later, targeting the southern storage and pumping facilities. The explosions were visible for miles. Satellite imagery captured enormous fires burning across the island. Thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air and was visible from commercial aircraft passing over the region. The damage assessment conducted by American intelligence in the hours following the strikes suggested that both target complexes had sustained severe damage. The oil export infrastructure that Iran had spent decades building was burning. In Washington, the initial reaction was cautious optimism. The strikes had hit their targets. The facility was clearly damaged. Iranian state media was quiet, which the White House interpreted as a sign of shock and disarray in Tehran. They were wrong about that silence. Iran was not silent because it was shocked. Iran was silent because its military was executing the second phase of a plan that had been in motion for months. While American attention was focused on the burning oil terminals on Kharg Island, the IRGC was activating the trap. Within hours of the Kharg strikes, American naval commanders began receiving reports that they initially found difficult to believe. Radar contacts, dozens of them, then hundreds, coming from multiple directions simultaneously, fast attack boats emerging from camouflage positions along the Iranian coastline, missile batteries activating from positions that had not been on any intelligence assessment, submarines detected, or rather not detected until they were already dangerously close, and then the missiles started flying. Not ballistic missiles this time, anti-ship cruise missiles, the Noor, the Qadr, Iranian versions of Chinese-designed weapons, flying low over the water at speeds that compressed the reaction time for American ship defenses to seconds, from multiple directions, in numbers that overwhelmed the point defense systems of individual ships, even as the Aegis cruisers tried to coordinate a fleet-wide response. The US fleet had sailed into the trap. And the trap had just closed. The trap closes, America's worst day at sea. What followed in the next 45 minutes was the most intense naval combat that American forces had experienced since World War II. The IRGC's anti-ship missile barrage was not a single volley. It was a sustained, multi-wave attack coordinated across dozens of launch platforms, shore-based missile batteries, fast attack boats, helicopter-launched weapons, and submarine-fired torpedoes. Each wave came from a slightly different direction, at a slightly different altitude, designed to force the American Aegis defense systems to constantly recalculate their intercept solutions. The Aegis combat system is extraordinarily capable, but it operates within physical constraints that no amount of engineering can overcome. There are only so many interceptors on any given ship. There are only so many targets that can be engaged simultaneously. And when the attack comes from every direction at once, when fast attack boats are closing from the north while missiles are inbound from the east and torpedoes are running from the south, the mathematics of defense become brutally unfavorable. American ships fought back ferociously. Phalanx CIWS systems spun up and began engaging incoming missiles at close range. Standard missiles were fired in rapid succession against the larger, more threatening inbound weapons. Helicopters launched to hunt the fast attack boats. FA-18s were scrambled from the carrier deck and went to work against the Iranian surface threat. But the damage was done. Several American ships sustained hits. Damage reports flooded the fleet communications networks. One destroyer took a catastrophic hit amidships that killed dozens of sailors and left it dead in the water. A cruiser reported flooding after what appeared to be a torpedo impact. The carrier itself, which had been holding back from the worst of the engagement, found itself surrounded by a fast attack boat swarm that had gotten closer than anyone had imagined possible. The situation was critical, not catastrophic. American damage control teams are among the best trained in the world, and they fought to save every ship with everything they had. But critical, and it was at exactly this moment, when American forces were fully engaged, when the fleet was under attack from multiple directions simultaneously, when every American asset in the region was focused on surviving the IRGC's trap, that Israel made its decision. Israel turned and ran. Israel flees. The alliance fractures. The decision by Israel to withdraw from the operation, to pull back its forces that had been committed to support the American strikes and stand ready to absorb any Iranian retaliation, is one that will be debated and analyzed for years. Israel's calculation in the moment was not cowardice. Let that be absolutely clear. The Israeli Defense Forces are among the most battle-hardened and capable military organizations in the world. They have fought wars of survival against enemies that vastly outnumbered them. They do not flinch from hard decisions. The Israeli withdrawal was a strategic calculation, and it was driven by a specific piece of intelligence that Tel Aviv received in the hours before the trap fully closed. Israeli intelligence had picked up signals, communications intercepts, satellite imagery, and reports from human sources inside Iran, suggesting that the IRGC was preparing to activate a secondary strike package specifically targeted at Israeli territory, not at Israeli forces in the Gulf, at Israel itself, Tel Aviv, Haifa, the Dimona nuclear facility. Faced with that threat, Israeli military commanders made the calculation that their primary obligation was to defend Israeli soil and Israeli citizens. Continuing to support American naval operations in the Gulf, while Israel itself was under threat of ballistic missile attack, was a commitment that Israeli commanders were not willing to sustain. The withdrawal was rapid and, from the American perspective, came without adequate warning. American commanders who had been counting on Israeli electronic warfare support, Israeli aerial assets, and Israeli intelligence feeds suddenly found those resources disappearing at the exact moment they needed them most. The recriminations between Washington and Jerusalem were immediate and fierce. American officials, speaking privately, used language about Israeli actions that has rarely been used between close allies. Israeli officials responded that they had a right, indeed an obligation, to prioritize the defense of their own country. Both sides had a point, and both sides were, in the heat of the crisis, unable to see past their own perspective to understand the others. The alliance held, technically, but it had been stressed in ways that would leave marks. The trust deficit created in those 45 minutes in the Persian Gulf would take years to repair, and while Washington and Jerusalem argued, the IRGC was already sending a different message to the world. The IRGC's message, what Iran proved to the world. In the aftermath of the engagement, Iranian state media went from silence to triumphalism almost overnight. And while the specific claims made by Iranian propaganda were, as always, exaggerated and selectively edited, the underlying reality that they were communicating was genuine. Iran had done something that most military analysts had considered extremely difficult, if not impossible. It had absorbed a major American strike on critical infrastructure, activated a pre-planned military response, inflicted significant damage on American naval assets, driven a visible wedge between the United States and Israel, and done all of this without crossing the threshold that would trigger a full-scale American military response. That last point is crucial. The IRGC's trap was not designed to sink the US fleet. It was not designed to trigger World War III. It was designed to demonstrate capability, to show Iran's adversaries and the world that the cost of attacking Iran is higher than America had calculated. This is deterrence in action, not nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence. The message from Tehran was clear. You can strike Kharg Island, you can damage our oil infrastructure, but you will pay a price. Your ships will be hit, your sailors will die, your alliances will be strained, and we will still be here. The global audience for that message was paying close attention. China, Russia, North Korea. Every government that has been wondering whether American military power can be successfully challenged took note of what happened in the Persian Gulf. More specifically, every government that has territory or interests that American military power might one day be directed against was running the same calculation. If Iran, a country under crippling sanctions, without the most modern military equipment, without nuclear weapons, can trap and damage an American fleet in the Persian Gulf, what does that mean for the calculations of powers that are better resourced and better armed? This is the geopolitical significance of what happened. It is not just about Iran, it is about the credibility of American military deterrence on a global scale, and it is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. The global fallout, oil, markets, and the world economy. While the military drama was unfolding in the Persian Gulf, another crisis was developing in financial markets around the world. The strikes on Kharg Island sent oil prices into immediate freefall, or rather, into an immediate spike. Within hours of the first news reports reaching the markets, crude oil futures jumped by more than 15%. By the time trading closed in Asia and opened in Europe, the price of a barrel of crude had reached levels not seen since the energy crises of previous decades. This is the economic weapon that cuts both ways when you strike Kharg Island. Yes, you damage Iran's ability to export oil, but you also signal to global markets that the Persian Gulf, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply travels, is a combat zone, and markets price that risk immediately and brutally. Countries that depend heavily on oil imports, Japan, South Korea, India, most of Europe, face sudden and severe energy cost increases. Supply chains that had already been strained by years of geopolitical disruption were placed under additional pressure. Inflation, which central banks around the world had been working to bring under control, received a new upward shock. China, which has been Iran's primary oil customer and has carefully cultivated its relationship with Tehran as a counterweight to American pressure, faced a particular dilemma. Too visible a response to American strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure would risk a direct confrontation with Washington that Beijing was not yet ready for. Too passive a response would signal to Tehran and to China's other partners that Chinese protection is not reliable when it really counts. Beijing chose a middle path, strongly worded diplomatic statements, calls for restraint and dialogue, behind-the-scenes communications to Tehran expressing support, and quiet, practical steps to help Iran restore some oil export capacity through alternative channels that were harder for American enforcement to reach. Russia, for its part, watched with undisguised satisfaction. Every crisis that diverts American military and political attention from Europe and Ukraine is, from Moscow's perspective, a welcome development. The Kremlin's public statements were carefully neutral. Its private calculations were anything but. The world had just gotten more dangerous, and the financial markets, with their cold mathematical logic, were pricing that danger in real time. The aftermath. Where do we go from here? In the days and weeks following the strikes on Kharg Island and the IRGC's response, the questions being asked in Washington were fundamental ones. Questions that went to the heart of American strategy in the Middle East and beyond. Had the strikes achieved their objective? The Kharg Island facility was damaged. Iranian oil exports were disrupted. But Iran was already working to repair the damage, rerouting exports through alternative facilities, and the disruption, while significant, appeared to be measured in months rather than years. The strategic goal of forcing Iran to the negotiating table had not been achieved. If anything, the IRGC's successful trap had strengthened the hand of Iran's hardliners, who could now argue that military resistance works. Was the response proportionate? This was the question being debated most intensely in the halls of the Pentagon and the National Security Council. Iran had inflicted real damage on American naval assets. American sailors had been killed and wounded. The political pressure for retaliation was intense, but any significant escalation carried the risk of triggering exactly the kind of full-scale regional war that everyone, including the Trump administration, wanted to avoid. What should America's relationship with Israel look like going forward? The Israeli withdrawal during the crisis had exposed a genuine divergence of interests and priorities that the two countries would need to work through carefully. The alliance was strong enough to survive the episode, but surviving it and emerging from it stronger were two different things. And perhaps most fundamentally, what was the long-term strategy for dealing with Iran? Strike after strike, sanction after sanction, crisis after crisis had failed to resolve the fundamental tension between American interests in the Middle East and Iran's regional ambitions. The trap at Kharg Island was a symptom of a deeper strategic problem that military strikes alone cannot solve. There were no easy answers to any of these questions, and the people responsible for finding answers, in the White House, in the Pentagon, in Congress, and in allied capitals around the world, were grappling with the full complexity of a situation that had developed in ways nobody had fully anticipated. The Persian Gulf remained tense, American forces remained on high alert, the IRGC remained ready, and the next move in this dangerous strategic chess game had not yet been made. Outro 2 strikes on Kharg Island. That was the decision. That was the order. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a demonstration that in the modern world, military power alone does not guarantee strategic success, that a smaller, less technologically advanced force, fighting on its own ground, with patience and preparation and a deep understanding of its adversary's decision-making patterns, can create outcomes that reshape the strategic landscape. The IRGC set a trap. The US fleet fell into it. Israel fled, and the world watched. None of this means that American military power is diminished. The United States remains the most powerful military force on Earth by a considerable margin. But power and the ability to translate power into strategic outcomes are not the same thing. And the gap between the two is where adversaries like Iran operate. The lesson of Kharg Island is the lesson that great powers have been slow to learn throughout history. Military force is a tool, and like all tools, it is most effective when it is precisely matched to the problem it is being used to solve. When it is used crudely, when it is driven by political pressure more than strategic logic, it can create problems bigger than the ones it was meant to fix. Trump ordered 2 strikes. Iran had planned for them, and the world that emerged from those strikes was more complicated, more dangerous, and more uncertain than the one that existed before the order was given. That is the nature of conflict in the modern world, and it is a reality that Command Brief exists to help you understand. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is happening in the Middle East and why it matters to every one of us, please hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to understand these events, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Kharg Island strikes were the right call? What should America's next move be? Let's have that conversation. Stay informed. Stay sharp. The world needs people who understand it clearly. This has been Command Brief.